Sandy Island has a fascinating history, and it's my pleasure to bring this presentation to you today. It is the largest undeveloped island along the eastern seaboard of the United States. It has 12,000 acres and the highest elevation in Georgetown County at 78 feet. So it is an anomaly in our low country. The island was created by the hydrology of the two rivers that surround it on the eastern and western sides, and the water was rushing to, it still is rushing to Winyah Bay. So that is what caused the sand dunes to accumulate on the island and to be pushed up over centuries and millenniums of time. The towering dunes were, they were gradually encircled by alluvial soils, which formed cypress swamps, and this created the ideal environment for growing rice. So that is how it became part of the rice culture. The swamps are also, in this day and age, attractive to waterfowl and hunters alike. So it has remained popular despite the fact that the rice culture ended in the 19th century. Approximately 9,165 acres of Sandy Island were permanently conserved in 1996 and are now part of the Waccamaw National Wildlife Refuge. And it is owned by the Nature Conservancy and managed by U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services. And altogether, the Waccamaw National Wildlife Refuge now has 35,000 acres of land in the river basins leading to Winyah Bay. The Refuge and Environmental Center that supports this project is located on Highway 701 at Yohanna Bluff, which was a 18th century trading post site and also a part of the early history of this area. It was there that Native Americans in the area traded with the British for guns, ammunition, and other basic supplies. The refuge manager is and has been since its inception, Craig Sasser. Now, the island itself is bordered on the eastern shore by the Waccamaw River and the western shore by the Great Pee River. On the north end are Bull Creek and Little Bull Creek, which link the two rivers, and on the south end is Thoroughfare Creek, which links the Waccamaw and PD. And below there, predominantly it is salt or freshwater marsh, and there's only one plantation between the rivers below Sandy Island, and that is Holly Hill, and it is a little hill surrounded by wetlands. So beyond there, it's all wetlands leading all the way to Winyah Bay. Now, things that I want to tell you, there are Native American pottery sherds and biface tools and points that are found on the island that indicate that the Native Americans lived there long before the Europeans or their slaves ever set foot on the island. They always chose to build their villages on high land near deep water because the water was their method of transportation, so that was a priority for them. And they named the various areas, and it's interesting that even today we have the Waccamaw, PD, Winyah, and Hobcaw, Native American terms, still in use to designate those areas. The island is renowned in present times for its Gullah culture, and it is began 3 centuries ago, and the African American descendants are now included in the Gullah Geechee National Heritage Corridor, which was established in 2006 to recognize significant African American locations between Wilmington, North Carolina, and Jacksonville, Florida. The principal village on Sandy Island is Monterina, and it is 17 miles north of Georgetown and approximately 2 miles inland from the Atlantic Ocean. The island is also noteworthy for state endangered swallowtail kites and federally listed red-cockaded woodpeckers. And the woodpeckers prefer to live in live, old-growth, longleaf pine trees, which abound on the island, but which are scarce in many other places due to the timbering of them over the years. Sandy Island's dimensions of 7 miles by 4 miles encompass about 2,000 acres that the Huntingtons purchased in addition to the Brook Green properties in the early 1930s. The plantations that they bought on mainland Waccamaw Neck were from north to south Laurel Hill, Springfield, Brook Green, and the Oaks Plantation. Now, these were historically significant properties to American history because in 1791, George Washington visited at Brook Green. He had been a friend of William Alston, Jr., who had recently died when he arrived. And so he met the widow and later married her. But Alston had named his son Washington Alston in recognition of the friendship between the two men. Now, Washington Alston was actually born at Brook Green, and he is world-renowned and considered the American Titan of art, and he was also a poet. Now, a decade after George Washington visited, Theodosia Burr was married to Joseph Alston and moved into the Oaks Plantation, which is the southernmost part of the Brook Green property. Now, later on, in the 1920s, Brook Green was owned by Dr. Julius Mood Peterkin, and his daughter, Julia Mood Peterkin, wrote several books using the Gullah language to tell about the lives of the people on the Brook Green properties and also on Sandy Island. And her book, Scarlet Sister Mary, won the Pulitzer Prize in 1928. So it was a very significant happening for a woman to win the prize and for it to be an African-American topic. These Sandy Island parcels were of these ocean to river plantations. All are undeveloped, and their management, as I said earlier, is contracted with Fish and Wildlife through Brook Green Gardens, who owns the property. Included in the Huntingtons' purchase were 3 miles of oceanfront property where they built their home, their local home, Atalaya, which is a Moorish castle because Archer Huntington preferred the Spanish architecture. So he designed that, and it remains today as part of Huntington Beach State Park. Now, the park still belongs to Brook Green Gardens Corporation, but it is leased and has been leased since 1960 to the South Carolina Department of Parks, Recreation, and Tourism, and it operates as Huntington Beach State Park. And there is some remaining Sandy Island real estate, which is either privately owned or owned by heirs of earlier owners who are part of the African American community on the island. Now, let's talk about the planters for a little while. The research reveals there are many common tendencies in the operation of southern plantations, particularly in isolated areas like Sandy Island and, to a lesser degree, the Waccamaw Neck, and then the Plantersville area, which is west of the PD River surrounding Sandy Island. Successful agricultural and plantation practices were exchanged by planters through discussion, and this helped them to improve their operations. They shared knowledge and learned from each other what worked and what didn't. And in order to formalize this more, they modeled clubs after the Winyah Indigo Society, which was incorporated in 1857 in Georgetown, and that addressed the indigo planters' concerns. But the Murrells Inlet faction of planters organized the Hot and Hot Fish Club, and it moved around because hurricanes kept knocking down their meeting place. But it was established before 1812, and not to be outdone, the planters on the west side of the PD River said, well, we can do that too. So they formed the PD Planters Club, and they built a special meeting facility at Lawn Plantation in Plantersville, which opened in 1839, and both of these planter clubs were dissolved with the beginning of the Civil War because all of its able-bodied members went off to fight in the war. Now, they would meet and talk about news, they would talk about politics, and also their plantation activities, because these were very successful and ambitious men. But the ones who lived on Sandy Island, the few planters that actually lived on Sandy Island were not enough to form an organization. So they joined one or more of the neighboring organizations, and this gave them membership and camaraderie, which they desperately needed. They wanted to mimic the success of their neighbors, and so that was how they established that opportunity. Now, these were social clubs as well, but in addition to that, there was the Winyah All Saints Agricultural Society, formed in 1842. It also met at Lawn Plantation, and they were more organized. They were serious about learning, and they did academic reports and helped each other improve the agricultural process of rice cultivation. They also overlapped memberships in some cases with the Winyah Indigo Society, which raised their social profile as well as their political profiles. And the region's preeminent rice planters at the peak of the rice culture were Colonel Joshua John Ward of Brookgreen Plantation, who owned over 1,000 slaves, Robert Francis Withers Alston of Shakora Wood Plantation, who was the governor of South Carolina in 1856 to 1858, and Plowden Charles Jeanette Weston of Hagley Plantation, who was the lieutenant governor of South Carolina from 1862 to 1863. Now, these men obviously shared information about rice competitions, and two of them won international competitions for the long grain rice that Colonel Ward first cultivated and named Carolina Gold rice. That is what our region is known for. And he took top honors at the 1852 Paris exhibition. And Governor Alston won a silver medal at the 1855 Paris exhibition, plus a gold medal the next year in Algiers. Several of these rice medals are today on display at the Rice Museum in Georgetown, and so you can go and view them. Now, Dr. Edward Thomas Harriet, who lived at Monterina Plantation on Sandy Island, won a rice medal at the 1851 World's Fair in London. This was called the Crystal Palace Exhibition, and it was held in an enormous glass structure. Now, Dr. Harriet was so proud of his accomplishment that he actually attended the exhibition. And because his father had immigrated to America from Scotland after the exhibition visit, he went to Scotland and met cousins that on his father's side that he had never had the opportunity to visit with. And he also, we think, visited Duralton Castle, which was the family home place there. And he must have been inspired because after he returned home, he owned a plantation on the west side of the Great Pee River named Richfield Plantation, and he renamed it Duralton. And that today is the Samworth Wildlife Center. It belongs to the state as well. Now, let's talk about slavery for a minute. Very few of the 18th and 19th century rice planters ever lived on isolated Sandy Island because to go and visit their mainland friends, they had to travel by boat. So they optimized their Sandy Island properties by having slaves convert its abundant tidal waters into rice fields and put the slave cabins on the highland in the middle of all this. And this probably worked well for the slaves because once they had finished their daily tasks, they were free to do what they wanted to do, and they engaged in doing little gardens and visiting with their neighbors. But also nearby was a large overseer's house in case they needed something or needed supervision on anything. Now, this arrangement made it such that they could lock up the boats and the slaves couldn't escape because most of them did not know how to swim. And this was considered so important that actually there were laws passed which said that it was unlawful to teach slaves to swim. Now, the slaves were motivated to help the planter with his agricultural goals because they needed housing, food, and clothing. So that was their inspiration. They prepared their own meals, and they were supplemented by the planter with basic things such as salt, flour, bacon, rice, and molasses. And during the winter season, the planters would also supplement their diet with meat and other things as needed. But basically their meals were one-pot meals cooked over an open fire, either outdoors if the weather permitted or in the fireplace of the cabin as needed. And these meals were a water-based meal with vegetables added and any kind of small game they were able to trap, such as birds, squirrels, opossums, raccoons, turtles. All of these were suitable to put in and make a broth to which they usually added rice or sometimes cooked separate rice and put the stew over the rice. Now, they also made cornbread when they had meal to prepare that. In the 18th century, the slaves ate from bowls which they made themselves, and these were pottery bowls. They're called colonial-ware because they were used during the colonial period. And as opposed to the Native American potteries we find that were strengthened with sand and small pebbles and Spanish moss, the African American pots were simply the pure clay, and they like to burnish the outsides of them to a smooth finish, so they have a distinctive feel that identifies them as separate from the Native American potteries. Now, by the 19th century, planters were getting more wealthy, and they wanted to show their wealth by buying manufactured dishes for their slaves. So they started with very simple, mainly undecorated wares. Probably the most popular was the blue edge wares, whiteware, that we find so frequently on slave cabin sites. And so the English would ship these things over, and the planters would order the lowest line of ceramics for the slaves, but the finest dishes for their table. Now, they also trained some of the slaves as seamstresses, and the seamstresses made all the clothes for the slave population, and sometimes clothing for the planter's family, depending on the circumstances and what was needed. Now, shoes were another problem. They had to order the shoes, but some of the planters would order them in batches, while one enterprising Waccamaw Neck planter actually had the slaves make tracings of their feet, and he would send that in as his order to be sure the shoes fit. Collectively, the slaves needed a language that they could communicate because they were from many different African tribes. And they also had to understand English to work with the planter's family. And so they devised what has been termed Gullah. And it was a cobbled together or Creole language that used English words as needed. But when the slaves wanted to talk to each other in the presence of their planter's family, they would just speed up their conversation so that the planters couldn't follow it. And the Gullah word is thought to have arisen from the word Angola, which is the country in Africa where many of the slaves were sourced and captured for enslavement. Now, some of them were actually rounded up by the African royalty. They got rid of the members of their population that were troublemakers. They simply sold them into slavery. And others were captured by enterprising Americans who wanted to profit from the slave trade. Now, the Rice Coast came to be known as the area on West African area where rice was cultivated. So these slaves were attractive because they came with a working knowledge of how to grow rice. And whereas the Waccamaw Neck and Plantersville planters knew that they had the ideal land for growing rice, they didn't have an idea of how to do that. So these slaves brought that knowledge and expertise with them. So they were considered a real asset. Now, slavery involved corporal punishment for insubordination. And this was the darker side of slavery, the sad part of it. But the punishable infractions that were common were failure to complete assigned tasks, stealing, lying, escaping, and physical aggression. Usually whippings were the punishment with a leather strap, and The plantation overseer was in charge of administering these. This was normally a white male who reported to the planter. He was the manager of the agricultural aspect of the plantation. Or on occasion, a slave driver was assigned to do this. And he was an esteemed male slave who reported to the overseer. Repeat offenders were usually sold as a last resort, which of course broke up families and caused a lot of trauma in the slave village. But slaves were the most valuable commodity on a plantation. Some of them, the strong male workers, cost up to $2,000 apiece at auction by 1860. So it was counterproductive for them to be beat and detained and not working. And a lot of this history remains undocumented because the focus of early historians was on the wealth of the plantations, the lives of the planter family, and also its economic impact on our area. Now, unrecorded history is hard to reconstruct, so there's a lot of bias in more recent accounts of this. There was a federal act prohibiting the importation of slaves passed in 1807, which reflected the nation's growing aversion to slavery, but unfortunately, some illicit slave trade continued beyond that point. But this slave-based plantation economy, which was well established and very profitable, so deeply appreciated, was such a strong part of the Southern culture that it became obvious over time that the only way to resolve this dispute about slavery was to go to war. Now, by the end of this Civil War from 1861 to 1865, most slaves alive were children, grandchildren, or great-grandchildren of native Africans, and they from different tribes. So they had no memories of Africa and a sort of diluted awareness of their cultural heritage. So they became known as African Americans, which of course acknowledged their African heritage but their American birthplace. Obstacles to interpreting all of this history from hundreds of years ago include the fact that there are no antebellum buildings remaining on Sandy Island. When the Huntingtons arrived in 1930, they began photographing everything as it was, and these images are surviving. But those buildings photographed in 1930 didn't last much longer because they were antebellum buildings. And Bayard Wooten was hired to come to this area. She was a renowned photographer from North Carolina. And she also brought Doris Ullman, another renowned Southern photographer. And they photographed Sandy Island and Brook Green during the Depression years. Now, the architecture that might have remained was the bricks. The wood rotted away or was burned as the buildings fell down. But the plantation bricks, as we call them, became very popular for recycling in structures to lend a historic flavor to them. So they have been used throughout the region, and what remains today on Sandy Island is the archaeology, the evidence below ground. And there is a plan to do extensive archaeology on Sandy Island, but it has yet to be funded. Now, Georgetown's legal records were moved from the Georgetown courthouse when Sherman was coming through, Union Army General William Sherman, and they were moved into the state's interior and ironically destroyed because Sherman changed his route through South Carolina and created extensive fires in Columbia and Sherall. And these fires destroyed the legal records of Georgetown County up to that time. And as a result, the real estate chains of title are interrupted, and there's been extensive research by historians to reconstruct what we do know from family records and surviving maps that were in private hands. Another challenge was that planters often rounded up their plantations. As they became more successful, they wanted larger plantations. So they only needed one piece of property. It was the one next door to their plantation. But they would do this. They would add new properties. They would sell off what they didn't like. And in addition to that, they would buy additional plantations outright. So because planters and everyone else lived shorter lifespans in the 18th and 19th centuries, there was a lot of retitling of property over the years, much more frequently than we would do today. And also, family names were reused over and over and over. First names became surnames, surnames became first names, and so it's difficult sometimes to interpret these old land records, but there are 8 plantations which are most prominently associated with Sandy Island during that heyday of the 18th and 19th centuries when the rice culture was at its peak. These are Monterina, Oak Lawn, Sandy Knowe, Pipe Down, Hassel Hill, Brickville, Ruinville, and Oakhampton. So I will talk a little bit about each of these as we go on. All of these plantations likely had emancipated slaves living in them following the Civil War because, quite frankly, they didn't know where to go other than where they'd always lived. That was home to them as well. But the duration of freedmen and families living on Sandy Island was most notable in a few settlements as the others became run down and abandoned. Annie Village at Ruinville Plantation. Blaine was the community at Sandy Knowe Plantation. Brownville had a brief existence at Brickville Plantation. And Monterina was the name of the settlement at the former Monterina Plantation, and it is the main one surviving today. Now, during the colonial and antebellum years, the boundaries of the parishes were changed over time. Sandy Island was part of Lower All Saints Waccamaw Parish, which was principally east of the Waccamaw River. This parish, along with Prince Frederick Pee Parish, which was west of the Great Pee River, and Prince George Winyah Parish, which centered around the town of Georgetown, comprised Georgetown District in 1860. There was an Upper All Saints Waccamaw Parish in Horry District, which is now Horry County, and it was the less populated portion of the elongated coastal area that was the Waccamaw Neck and beyond. Now, the Georgetown district, parishes handled matters of church and electoral precinct, as sanctioned by the Church Act of 1706. But precincts were later removed from church business to comply with the separation of church and state, which was first suggested by Thomas Jefferson and promoted by the United States government. Georgetown District became Georgetown County in 1868. As for religion, the slaves received weekly religious training from Englishman Reverend Alexander Glennie of All Saints Church, Waccamaw, established in 1739 on mainland Pawleys Island. Now, Reverend Glennie came to the Waccamaw Neck from England at the request of Plowden Weston to teach his young son, Plowden C.J. Weston, as a private tutor. And they realized that he had an inclination toward religious study, and so they suggested to him that he go and receive training and become a minister. Now, he did this, and he returned to All Saints Church and began to preach at plantation slave chapels. Many of the plantations had their own slave chapel, and there were two on Sandy Island. One was at Monterina and the other at Sandy Knowe Plantation. Now, Christianity was at times in conflict with the practices and beliefs of the slaves, but the planters supported it anyway because they believed that it taught the slaves moral and ethical behavior and would cause the plantation to function more smoothly. And the slaves liked it because they got time off from their work, and they also enjoyed the singing aspects of it. Now, the planter families on Sandy Island needed a church of their own. So St. John the Evangelist Church was built in 1857 east of the Waccamaw River on the bluff at Wachesaw Plantation. Which was previously owned by Allard Blaine, the French Huguenot. He passed it to Reverend James Lynch Blaine, who instigated the construction of the church, and later to Dr. Allard Blaine Flagg, who was his son. This was called Upper Church because of its position within Lower All Saints Waccamaw Parish. If you can imagine the All Saints Waccamaw Church in Pawleys Island, and to go there from Murrells Inlet by ox cart or horseback was not real practical. So there was an upper church in Murrells Inlet and a lower church on what is today Arcadia Plantation property, so that the planter families on Pawleys Island could get to church in a reasonable traveling distance. Now, this church, the upper church, was only used for a short time. After the Civil War, the families on Sandy Island were left because of the unrest at the time, and the church was dismantled. It was no longer in use. So Dr. Flagg, who was the owner, decided to take all of this lumber and build him a beach house on the shore. And his freed slaves said, "Oh no, you shouldn't do that. A house should not be built from a church." So halfway through construction, a hurricane blew it down. He began to rebuild it, and this happened a second time. And he decided he agreed with his freedmen. Now, there is a step from this church on display at Kimball's Restaurant at Wachesaw, and you can view it. It's a brownstone step, one of several. The others were loaned out or given out in 1925 when Blaine Church was being built, and they were later replaced with more modern steps. But In the aftermath of the Civil War, there was tremendous chaos in the South. The slaves were angry. The freedmen were angry because of their previous treatment. They wanted more rights, and there was a lot of lawlessness going on. So some of the planters simply left. They didn't want to deal with it, and they left. And others wanted to stay, wanted to get the rice culture going again, and needed to figure out how to do that. So what they did is they established contracts with the freedmen who chose to continue to live in the slave cabins they had previously occupied. And they became, in effect, sharecroppers. I will pay you a minimal wage to work for me, and I will share the rice crop with you if you will stay and help me. But the phenomenal success that they had known before the Civil War was never to be realized again. And in the late 19th and early 20th century, there were severe hurricanes which destroyed the rice impoundments, and there wasn't enough labor to replace or repair these impoundments, and these were necessary for the rice cultivation, and so the rice culture pretty much was abandoned. It was no longer cost effective, and the commercial production of rice in Georgetown County ceased. So the rice that grows on Sandy Island now is wild rice. There is a little bit of that, and it's sort of a silent tribute to the golden past of Sandy Island. But what took its place was along the Mississippi River Delta, machinery was able to cultivate the rice fields, and the rice culture simply moved there. And the planter families gradually realized that they were never going to have the economic, social, political status that they had previously enjoyed. So they began to look for other ways to make a good living. Now, on Sandy Island, the people who stayed pretty much worked out a way to survive, and they grew rice on a much smaller scale because they knew exactly what they were doing. And the children, a lot of the children left. They weren't happy doing that. And some of them enrolled in the military, but many others went north where industry was hiring and they could get steady jobs. The parents of these families pretty much remained on the island and began to look to the Waccamaw Neck and other surrounding areas, Plantersville and even to Conway, for employment. And most of their jobs were service jobs. They were workers in various capacities, carpentry, all kinds of things. Monterina Plantation dates to 1732. It first belonged to John and William Alston, who were brothers, and their descendants would eventually own most Waccamaw Neck plantations at one time or another. Their friend was Indian trader William Wades, who also received Georgetown District land grants, including Sandy Island properties. They were father and son Indian traders, and the father was contracted after arriving here in 1694 to operate a trading post at Johanna's High Bluff. Now, they both, the father and son, each received land grants in the area, but they titled them identically, William Wades. So deciphering which was the father and which was the son on the grants was a challenge. Now, Dad's health didn't hold up, and Meredith Hughes became the predominant manager of the trading post at Johanna Bluff. But Thomas, Waring, Washington, and Withers were surnames of subsequent planters who owned Monterina Plantation. But the one that is best known is Dr. Edward Thomas Harriet. He belonged to the Hottentot Fish Club, and his wife was Elizabeth Stark Harriet. Now, Dr. Harriet was like many sons of planters. Their parents would encourage them to go to medical school so that if you don't like running the plantation, if you don't want to be a farmer, so to speak, you can be a medical doctor and make a good living. And it also was very convenient. Many planters had medical degrees. And if someone on the plantation got sick, whether it was a slave or a member of the planter's family, they could get medical care immediately and without sending for a doctor to come and make a house call. So it was a good plan that they had. Monterina's name comes from French, and it stands for Sand Mountain, which is an appropriate name. It consisted of 538 acres and had 115 slaves when Dr. Harriet died in 1854. Now, their daughter, Mary Elizabeth Harriet, married a fellow named Dr. James Ritchie Sparkman, who owned Birdfield Plantation in Plantersville. And so when Dr. Harriet died, the son-in-law, Dr. Ritchie, was able to take over the management of Monterina until the oldest son was able to assume that position. Now, he and his wife exchanged a plantation inheritance, and Dr. Harriet's Richfield Plantation, renamed Duralton Plantation, went to the Sparkmans. And what they did is Dr. Sparkman designed a significant house to go there. It was 30 rooms, basically the same floor plan on all 3 floors, and was built by slaves, of course, but it was one of the most significant plantations in the entire area, and it survives today. It later belonged to the Thomas Garvine Samworth and his wife Dora, and they left its 800 acres to DNR, South Carolina Department of Natural Resources, and it operates as Samworth Wildlife Management Area in Plantersville. Now, the daughter, Elizabeth Stark Harriet, never married, but her parents left her Monterina Plantation, and she moved to Charleston following Reconstruction. It was a more social place to live, I'm sure. And she decided to sell Monterina to an African American, Philip Washington, who had been the slave driver at Piatt Plantation. And he actually purchased 320 acres of Monterina Plantation in 1882. Now, he was a very enterprising man. He left after the Civil War and went to Georgetown and earned that money. And 2 years prior to that, he had approached this old maid, Miss Harriet, and asked her to buy 2 acres to build a church on Sandy Island. And she sold him 2 acres for $10. So he was inspired, and he came back 2 years later and said, I want to make a village for the people. And so that was how this transpired. Now, after he bought the acreage, he sold it to his friends and neighbors, and he amassed amount of money that when he died about 8 years later, he was able to leave an inheritance to his children. And this was probably the first time that had occurred amongst the freedmen families on Sandy Island. Now, the Harriets, like all planter families, had to get away from the plantation during the summer season because of the mosquitoes. So they retreated to what was called woodland or woodlawn, depending on who you talk to. But it was a 18th century house on Murrell's Inlet. And they would go there from mid-May until after the second frost of November. And the reason it was the second frost that was required was that the first frost killed the living mosquitoes, the second frost killed the larvae that would hatch in the interim time. So that would rid the plantation of mosquitoes for the winter season. But this house transferred to Henry Mood Wilcox of Marion, South Carolina, along with a tract of land, and the house actually later burned in 1980. Now, I could tell you all about malaria. The Anopheles mosquito is the carrier. The shoreline mosquitoes on the coast do not carry malaria. But rice cultivation requires stagnant water. So that is why the mosquitoes were so prevalent on the plantations. And if you read plantation memoirs, they often start with so-and-so got chills and fever and soon died. And that was the malaria from the mosquito bites. Now, the African-American population has a genetic factor that prevents them or gives them more resistance to malaria, so they could continue to work on the plantations. And if they caught malaria, the symptoms were generally very mild. Monterina Village was established in 1882 and with the newly purchased property, and it remains an unincorporated settlement. Today, there's a public boat landing, the only one on the island. There's a small general store, a fire station with one vintage fire truck. There is a bed and breakfast, and there's also the opportunity for guided van tours. There were never paved roads on Sandy Island, so travel was by ox cart, but when the freed families began to build a little bit of money, they wanted cars on their island because there were distances to go. The church was a mile from the villages and that kind of thing. So many of them purchased cars, but the sand clogged the carburetors and they didn't last very long. So a new used car and a new used car and a new used car, and the cars began to pile up on the island, but they were not mobile. So what they did is when Sandy Island Landing was established at the south end of Brook Green property, Brook Green designated a place for them to launch forth to the island, and as opposed to cutting through the gardens to get to the Waccamaw Neck. And so they began to park their cars there. Their mail is delivered there, and so I think four-wheelers are more popular on the island now, but they still have problems too. Now, Sandy Island's population has gradually diminished over time. 450 residents lived there in the 1960s. By 2010, 200 residents live there. And today, the population fluctuates around the number 50 or below. But it is wonderful that these people can live there and say that for those many, many generations, they occupied the same land that their ancestors lived on. And not many families on mainland anywhere can say that they have been there that long. There was a school built on Sandy Island in 1932 by the Huntingtons, who took a sort of paternalistic interest in the island. And that school operated until 1965, when Georgetown County suggested that the students on Sandy Island needed to be integrated into public school and get a broader education. So that was done, and in order to make that happen, there was a school boat ferry. The first one was named the Prince Washington because Prince was the one who lobbied to bring electricity to the island and to get the ferry boat. And over the time, that boat broke down, and due to a tragic accident where it was unavailable and some school children were transported in a lesser boat, and there was a drowning. 3 people drowned. And so they got a new school ferry boat, which still operates today. It's called the New Prince Washington. Now, there are many surnames at Monterina Village. Generally, the slaves didn't have last names when they were slaves, so they took the names of their planters in many cases, and these included Elliott, Piatt, Withers, Washington, Lance, Collins, Young, Tucker, Williams, and Harriot. There were other families through marriages that ended up on the island. The Alstons, Simmons, Reed, R-E-A-D, Days, Poinsett, Robinson, Grant, Sparkman, Weathers, Nelson, and Stewart are all family names that have had a part in Monterina Village and other areas. I mentioned earlier about the New Bethel Church. It was located in proximity to all 3 villages on the island, Ruinville, Blaine, and Monterina. So wherever you were going from to attend church, you had to walk about a mile. Now, that church eventually fell into disrepair and was replaced with the New Bethel Missionary Baptist Church in 1951. And it has an annual reunion, Sandy Island reunion, that at the last reunion, 600 people attended that. It's phenomenal that love and loyalty for that time and place remains so strong after all these years. Other plantations, if you move from Monterina down Thoroughfare Creek, we come to Lawn Plantation, which belonged to Allard Blaine Flagg, who was a son-in-law of Joshua John Ward at Brook Green, and that's where Blaine Beach is, and many people today know that as a recreational place, and it is still popular for boaters during the boating seasons of the year. Now, there is a real estate development there known as Paradise Point, which began in the 1960s. There were canals dredged to create canal lots, and dirt was piled up on the property and resulted in a little lake there, a large lake there. And those lots were sold. They had a lot of problems with them because of sewage and processing the sewage and not having it run into Thoroughfare Creek. But you had to buy 3 or 4 lots, depending on whom you ask, and put in a septic tank. So that never really was fully developed, but you can still see it today. It's even visible from outer space. They call them the 5 fingers. Finger lakes is what they kind of look like. All right, the Oak Lawn owner, Dr. Flagg, had a summer home named the Hermitage in Merle's Inlet, And that is where the legend of Alice Blaine Flagg developed. And everybody knows that legend, so I'm not going to go into that. But in my research, I found 3 other Alice Flaggs. And because of the sympathy for her death, many relatives, or a number of relatives, chose to name their daughters Alice Flagg. There was one child who drowned in the Flagg flood of 1893, which is well known. And then Alice Flagg Simmons was a great-granddaughter of the Brook Green Plantation planter family. And then there was actually a second Alice Blaine Flagg who never married. She was lived to age 85 and is buried at Prince Frederick PD Church at Plantersville. So there are several Alice Flagg graves as a result of all of that. Sandy Knowe Plantation is further down Thoroughfare Creek from the Waccamaw Neck. It was granted to William Wades. It passed to Benjamin Waring, to Allard Blaine, who passed it to his son, Colonel Henry Allard Blaine. And they also had another plantation on Sandy Island, Cedar Hill. Now, we don't know much about it, but if you look at the number of slaves that he owned, Colonel Blaine owned, and the number of cabins on Sandy Knowe, there had to have been a second plantation. But the plantation is now 270 acres. It belongs to Furman Long, who is sort of I guess you'd call him a sort of a paternal guardian for Monterina. He's been very kind. He is a volunteer. He was a steward for the Nature Conservancy. But he just checks on things and makes sure that everything's going well. He helps out in emergencies and that kind of thing. There were 12 cabins at Sandy Knowe. They became Blaine, that community, and the Oak Lawn slaves moved over to Sandy Knowe and lived in those cabins. Pipe Down is moving up the PD River past Thoroughfare Creek, going north, and John Percival LaBruce was the early owner, and he and his wife left it to Mary Ann LaBruce. Now, Mary Ann didn't marry until she was 36 years old. She married the brother of Adele Pettigrew Alston of Shakora Wood Plantation. His name was Captain Thomas Pettigrew. They had 2 children very quickly, and he died in 1857. Now, her parents had given her part of their mainland plantation. They had given her Pipe Down, and she had purchased Hassel Hill. And so she was a wealthy woman. And she left her plantations, had planned for them in trust for her children, but unfortunately they both predeceased her, probably due to malaria. So that she ended up returning to her childhood home on the mainland and lived out her life at what she called Grove Hill Plantation. It's now within Arcadia. Hassel Hill Plantation was also hers, and then Brickville Plantation, as I mentioned earlier, was in the interior of Sandy Island. We're not real well versed on what its perimeters were, but it had a short life, but was used after the Civil War because it had an active well, and until the well went dry, families settled around it and used that drinking water. Ruinville Plantation is very fascinating. It is north of Monterina. We're back on the Waccamaw River now. And it was granted in 1735 to Andrew Broughton, who passed it to his brother, Captain Nathaniel Broughton. Now, they had a good pedigree. They were the sons of acting royal governor Thomas Broughton. They were grandsons of proprietary and royal governor Robert Johnson, and great-grandsons of proprietary governor Sir Nathaniel Johnson. And they built their home in Mulberry Plantation, the third oldest known house in South Carolina, and a beautiful home in Berkeley County, what is today Berkeley County. So they were a long way from Sandy Island. Now, I've wondered about the name Ruinville. Earlier they called it Ruinsville, and perhaps they thought they would go to ruin if they moved there. We're not sure, but anyway, it may also be that there were archaeological ruins there when they acquired the property, and that's where the name Ruinsville came from. But getting back, Captain Broughton's son passed the plantation the Sandy Island property to his two daughters, who sold it to Joseph Percival LaBruce in 1820. And LaBruce built a house and moved in. He married, and he didn't live a very long life, but the plantation was 566 acres in 1830. He died at age 35. He passed it to his youngest child and namesake, Joshua Ward LaBruce, because he too had married one of Joshua Ward's daughters. And they had a son named Joshua Ward who died in infancy. They had a second son named Joshua Ward who I could not find a death date for. So he too may have died early. But several other sons, and following the death of the senior Joshua Ward LaBruce, the family moved to the Pawleys Island area. But childhood deaths were very common. That's why many families had lots of children. They wanted to be sure they survived to adulthood and could continue the family lineage. Dr. Henry Collins Flagg and Rachel Moore Austin Flagg of Brook Green Plantation had two sons named Henry Collins Flagg. One died early, but the other one lived a long life. And Allard Blaine of Wachesaw Plantation lived 70 years after the death of his earlier brother of the same name. Now, Hagar Brown was an emancipated slave from the Oaks Plantation who, during the interviews for the Works Progress Administration's histories, she told Genevieve Wilcox Chandler that she had given birth to two daughters named Sally. When the first one died and she had another daughter, she intended to name her something else. She thought it might be bad luck. But mother was a Sally, the grandmother was a Sally, and she would have nothing but that child's name was Sally, and so it was. Ruinville is located on Sandhole Creek, which used to be called Beaver Creek, and encircled by rice fields. And at one point, there was only an overseer there, so he lived in the manor house. Now, nearby is Broad Lake and Broad Lake Cemetery, which has 200 graves, many of which are unmarked. But that is where Philip Washington, who began the real estate transfer to the freedmen, is buried, and he has a very nice marker. Now, slave burials are interesting in and of themselves because they believed in putting favorite objects belonging to the deceased on the graves for them to take to the afterlife. And so these things remain indefinitely, and it's always interesting to visit an African American cemetery and see these objects and speculate on what their significance is. Now, Annie Village is the name for the settlement at Ruinville Plantation. James Piatt was a freedman. He purchased 2 parcels totaling 634 acres to create Annie Village. And they didn't want to call their village Ruinville. So it was named for Annie Piatt, whom I suspect was his mother. And it's 2 miles north of Monterina on Ruinville Road, near the Brook Green Road intersection. And over time, it has shrunk down considerably. When I was there were 2 houses still occupied. They were occupied by Piatts. And many of the people, just for access to the public boat landing, have moved to Monterina Village. But one of the newest inhabitants of the island, which is going to be a problem, is armadillos. Armadillos have established themselves on the island, and they are digging up the entire island. Now, the last plantation I want to tell you about is Oakhampton. This is the northern parts of Sandy Island, and it later became known as Vaux because Captain William Percival Vaux purchased it. But it was covered in hardwoods, old-growth hardwoods and longleaf pines. So it was not suitable for rice culture, and as a result, timbering became its primary industry, and also the turpentine industry, because the pine sap was tapped for the naval store products of tar, pitch, and turpentine. Now, Oakhampton, there's not a brick left, I understand, although I suspect if you dig around you'll find some. But the Vaux family, when they occupied Oakhampton, spent their summers at Vaux Hall, also in Murrells Inlet. So they had a little colony of neighbors even when they were vacationing. But the house they built was a rambling 2-story house that was occupied into the 20th century, and it was a fishing and hunting lodge. It was a post office. It was the first library in Murrells Inlet. So it, whatever it took to make a living, it was utilized that way. There are many other plantations. I won't go into them on the mainland of both rivers, which owned parcels of Sandy Island. This was a way to have rice fields away from the manor house so that the mosquitoes were not such a problem. And I would say that to learn all this, you just have to buy the book and read it. But the one that I do want to mention is Hasty Point Plantation on the PD, because this has just been added to the Waccamaw National Wildlife Refuge in this past year, and will expand the access to Sandy Island as well as availability for course offerings and outdoor adventures, recreational opportunities. So that pretty much covers my presentation. I appreciate your patience, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.